Hello folks! Today I'm going to tell you a story. The current plan for the series is to alternate between talks and tales, and I want to tell you this story for two reasons. One, it's going to be relevant for the next video, and two, I love this story. It's so good. And not only that, it's important. It's part of our cultural heritage. It is one of the earliest references to one of Ireland's national icons. I could gush about it for hours. In fact, I love it so much. If you're very good over Christmas, you might find an extra special bonus video of me discussing this story in your stockings around Women's Christmas. That's January 6th for the uninitiated. I think I've bigged it up now, so hopefully you can only be disappointed by what I offer. I think we may as well begin. One very important thing. A fist is an archaic unit of measurement, measuring around 4 inches. You're welcome. Long ago, Ulster was ruled by a man called Fergus Léti, and one day he decided to throw a feast to celebrate his achievements as king. He had good cause to celebrate. He was well beloved by his people, and his army, the Crave Rua, was the strongest fighting force that Ireland had ever seen. And meanwhile, on a small island off the coast of Ulster, another king was also throwing a feast. This was Túath, king of Féilinn, lord of the Luchra, or as we know them now, leprechauns. Féilinn was a strange place, a magical island where few entered and fewer left. And the Luchra, well, as far as they were concerned, they were perfectly normal, average-sized people. Sure, didn't everyone dine on dormouse ribs and ride on hares like horses? During his feast, Túath began boasting of the might of his realm. He claimed that his warriors were the strongest the world had ever seen, and that they could fight off any invasion force. This earned him cheers from his followers, and a winning smile from his wife Bevo. But his chief poet Eisirt just started to guffaw with laughter. When Túath demanded to know the meaning of this, Eisirt told him that he had heard tell of the land of the giants, aka Ireland. He said that one man from that island could single-handedly best all 7 battalions at Túath's command. And Túath was not best pleased to hear this, so he decided, poet or no, he was going to throw Eisirt in the dungeon. Eisirt waited there for 3 days, until finally he begged for his release, so that he could travel to Ulster to prove his claims to the king. And Túath agreed. So off Eisirt went, atop Túath's magical hare that could walk on water. A surprisingly speedy form of transportation. He returned not 3 days later, telling tales of his adventures in the court of Vaca, and with the poet A in tow. A was King Fergus Léti of Ulster's second best poet and chief dwarf, who had agreed to accompany Eisirt back to Féilinn to prove his claims to Túath. And upon seeing A, who towered over the people of Féilinn, and upon learning that he was barely half the size of the majority of the people of Ulster, Túath quickly conceded that Eisirt had spoken true, and apologised for imprisoning him. But Eisirt wasn't satisfied. No. He wanted a bit of revenge. So he put a guess, a quasi-magical compulsion upon Túath to travel to Vaca and there sample the local delicacy. Porridge. Now Túath was not one for travelling alone, so he asked his wife Bevo to accompany him. Bevo was delighted to oblige. She loved to get away with her husband, and she had heard that the weather in Ulster was particularly fine this time of year. She'd heard wrong. They reached Vaca after travelling through a torrential downpour of biblical proportions, or as we call it over here, fierce mild. They managed to sneak into the kitchen, and soon found themselves faced with the porridge pot. It was massive. It towered over Bevo and Túath as they tried to figure out a way to reach the top. Túath climbed on the back of his magical hare and was just able to grab the rim. He pulled himself up, and looking down, he could see the ladle in the porridge below. But it was out of reach. So he lowered himself down with one hand and reached out for the ladle. He almost had it when he found himself losing his grip. His hand came away from the ledge, and Ulfdan found himself tumbling down, landing up to his neck in the sticky porridge. He cried out in despair. He told Bevo that all was lost. He was trapped, and that she must flee to save herself. But Bevo refused to abandon her husband, and instead chose to sing songs of love, until the cooks arrived in the morning. After a good chuckle at his predicament, they fished Ulfdan out of the porridge, and took him and Bevo to meet with their king, Fergus mac Léti. And Fergus was instantly suspicious of Bevo and Ulfdan. I mean, one diminutive visitor from a magical island once a year was perfectly normal and acceptable in ancient Ireland. But 3 of them, in as many days, highly suspect. Fergus was convinced that Bevo and Ulfdan were up to some sort of fairy mischief. He threatened to imprison and bind them, until Ulfdan offered that he and Bevo would stay at Auanbacca as long as Fergus pleased, and would not leave until he gave them express permission. Basically becoming his hostages. It's a pretty good gig, though. Ulfdan was sent to live with the servants, and Bevo was allowed to remain in the royal quarters. And as the days passed, Ulfdan began to notice a change in his wife. You see, Bevo had put on her seducing shoes and was strutting around Auanbacca like a woman on a mission, because she was. From the day she had met Fergus, she'd felt a stirring in her loins. A gnawing desire had grown in her day by day, as she thought about Fergus's stature. Just to be clear, she'd spied his bulge the day they'd met, and she wanted to ride that thing like a stripper pole. In fairness, his bulge had been hard to miss, given that Fergus was hung like a donkey. And Bevo's amorous advances did not go unnoticed, and Fergus was more than happy to indulge her curiosity. I'd love to tell you that I will spare you the details, but who are we kidding? While they were having sex, Fergus placed his hand on Bevo's head. She asked him why he did it, and he said it was for her safety. You see, Bevo stood at only 3 fists in height, whereas Fergus's mighty male member stood at an impressive 7 fists in height. Yet he watched in amazement, as his whole length had managed to penetrate Bevo. He put his hand on her head to make sure her shaft didn't burst through the top. "Take your hand away, Fergus," she said, "for my genitals are very capacious." That's vaginal hubris for you. Now, in case you're wondering, Ulfdan was absolutely fine with being cuckolded. As long as Bevo was happy, he was happy. In fairness, he did use the situation to wrangle himself a private room, but after that, he was perfectly content to spend his days wandering around Auanbacca, chiding the local women for poor pubic hair hygiene, and waxing lyrical about the proper trees to use as firewood, because Ulfdan always had his priorities straight. A year passed before the Luchra finally realised that their king and queen had been gone for quite some time, and they really should do something about that. They assembled all 7 battalions and marched on Auanbacca, where they met with Fergus mac Léti. First they bribed him, then they threatened him, and finally they begged him. But he refused and would not let their king and queen go. For a moment it looked as though things were about to get violent, when Ulfdan rushed out. He told his people to stand down and not shed their blood on his account, and to go home. And reluctantly they agreed, singing a lament as they retreated all the way back to Phelan. And upon seeing his people's deep sorrow, Ulfdan resolved that it was time to return home. He met with Fergus and asked what it would take to secure his freedom. He offered him gold and jewels. He offered him treasures, the likes of which Ulster had never seen before. But Fergus refused them all. until Ovdon offered him his most prized possession of all, his magic shoes. These were very special. They were made from white bronze, inlaid with gold, and were surprisingly light and comfortable. They perfectly fit the feet of the wearer and allowed them to travel through and over water as though it were land. Now, Ovdon had Fergus's attention, for Fergus McLéti was a man who appreciated a good pair of brogues. He asked to see the shoes, and when he put them on, he was sold. He immediately granted Fergus, Bevo, and Ovdon their freedom. And so Bevo returned to Phelan, to a emotionally fulfilling but sexually unsatisfying marriage to Ovdon. And sadly, they take no further part in our story. Meanwhile, Fergus was just loving his new shoes. He was sprinting across lakes, he was running down waterfalls, he even ran the full length of the Liffey before it became the toxic waste overflow we now know and tolerate. He frankly was having the time of his life. He even did the dirty dancing lift on the Shannon. But sadly, like the Irish economy circa 2007, the good times were soon to end. You see, Fergus made the mistake of travelling to Lochra, where he encountered the Shinach. The Shinach was a vicious water monster, complete with gnashing teeth and over-inquisitive tentacles. Upon seeing this hideous beast, Fergus screamed in terror and fled, his face freezing into a rictus grin. So much so, that from that day on, he became known as Fergus Wry Mouth. Not that anyone actually called him back to his face, no. Despite his love of adultery, kidnapping, and let's face it, extortion, Fergus was really popular. So much so that they hid what had happened from him. They kind of had to. Otherwise he would have been out of a job. To be king back then, you had to be physically perfect, free from blemish or disfigurement. But Fergus did eventually find out the truth. And when he did, he was incensed. He vowed revenge on the Shinach. And always a fan of spectacle, he invited the entire population of Ulster to attend his battle. Everyone rushed to Lochra to watch as the king dove into the lake and soon found the Shinach. The water began to churn red with their frenzied fighting and gushing blood, until after many, many hours it calmed. The still surface of the lake was eventually broken as Fergus dragged himself out, battered, bruised and bleeding, carrying the Shinach's head in his hands. He lifted it high above his shoulders, looked out at the assembled crowd and cried, "Man of Ulster, I have conquered!" before collapsing to the ground dead. A big smile plastered on his once again pristine face. Guess he was thinking of the last time he shagged Bevo. And that's all, folks.